I want you to forget everything you learned about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492 and discovering America. This is one of the biggest colonial lies ever told. Imagine this, it's October 12th, 1492, and you're chilling on the beach in the Bahamas. You're one of millions of Lucayan Taino people who see 3 ships off in the horizon. And the people who step off these ships are starving, confused, and probably a little smelly. And the man you meet is Cristobal Colon, aka Christopher Columbus. Columbus himself recorded this first encounter, and here are some of the things he wrote in his journal. He describes the Lucayan as handsome, gentle, and incredibly generous, even intelligent. But then he writes, they would make fine servants, and with 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. This first encounter is not a story of a brave explorer discovering a new world. It's a story of conquest. And of course, you can't discover a place where millions of people already call home. It's like me discovering your house and then forcing you to live in the shed in the backyard. Now that wouldn't be very nice, and either was Columbus, because this first encounter sets in motion one of the worst genocides in human history, and it's all built on historical lies. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome back to my Indigenous Studies Masterclass. We're still in our deep dive into settler colonial mythology and stereotypes. And if you're feeling like you need a little coffee or something stronger to handle all these historical falsehoods, you're not alone. Today in episode 5, part 2, we're going to deconstruct some of the biggest historical lies that erase the past, simplify the present, and ultimately justify the conquest of Indigenous America. We're going to debunk 5 big ones. The myth that Columbus discovered an empty America, the myth of easy conquest, we can't leave out the Thanksgiving fairy tale, or the vanishing Indian myth. And we'll end with the dangerous stereotypes of free government checks, casinos, and taxes. Yeah, Indigenous peoples also pay taxes. But before we dive in, let's remember what we already learned. Treaty agreements are not handouts. These are sacred agreements between sovereign nations. And every single one of these colonial lies, from the empty land myth to free government checks, was designed to make the American public forget about this basic legal truth. Now let's dig in with one of the biggest tall tales ever told. Christopher Columbus discovered America, and there were hardly anybody even living here. This is the foundational lie of the colonial project, that these lands were discovered. And this myth contains a second lie, the idea that the land was mostly empty and there were very few indigenous peoples living here. The idea of terra nullius, nobody's land. Translation, the land doesn't belong to anybody, and we can take it. The myth or lie of discovery justifies and allows for the theft of the entire Western Hemisphere. But it was somebody's land. In reality, there were over 100 million people living across the Americas. Indigenous nations had sophisticated governance, massive cities, in some cases much larger than European capitals at the time, and advanced agricultural systems. This land wasn't empty. It was full of people, full of diverse indigenous cultures. The historical record is clear. Columbus and his men did not stop at calculated theft. Their arrival initiated a campaign of unspeakable violence against the Lucayan and other Taino people. We're talking about massacres, kidnapping for the slave trade, forced labor, and the brutal sexual assault of indigenous women. It wasn't exploration or discovery, it was a blueprint for genocide, and we need to come to terms with that. And here's a little side note. Christopher Columbus never reached what we call the United States today, but his arrival in the Caribbean initiated a campaign of violence, enslavement, and catastrophic introduction of European diseases. We'll explore the history of Columbus a little more in a future episode. Now let's talk about the myth of easy conquest. This is the idea that Native people were easily pushed off their homelands, that they fought a bit but ultimately lost, and resigned themselves to reservation life. The reality is, indigenous resistance to settler colonialism started in 1492, and it continues to this day. From major conflicts like the Pueblo Revolt, King Philip's War, the Plains Wars, to today's fights against pipelines, the defense of sacred sites like Oak Flat, and the mobilization against voter suppression, the struggle for indigenous sovereignty continues. Indigenous people are not relics who lost a battle 150 years ago. They are nations who have been in a 500-year struggle to protect their culture, their homelands, to protect their rights. And the only reason why indigenous nations exist across the Americas today is because of that resistance. Now let's talk about the Thanksgiving myth, the version of the happy pilgrims and the friendly Indians sharing a nice meal. The Thanksgiving myth is proof that you can convince people of almost any lie. And let's be honest, that iconic image of pilgrims and natives sharing a feast, well, it took a sad story of disease, power struggle, and eventual warfare and turned it into a holiday about table manners. There's a whole host of lies here. They didn't land at Plymouth Rock, they didn't eat cranberry sauce in Turkey, and they didn't call themselves pilgrims. They were called separatists, and those Indians, they have a name. They're called the Wampanoag, the people of the first light. Yes, there was a brief alliance between the Wampanoag and these English settlers. Did the Wampanoag and these newcomers have a feast? Possibly, but they didn't call it Thanksgiving. And that brief moment of cooperation between the Wampanoag and settlers quickly turned into massacres, broken agreements, and land theft across New England. The colonization and dispossession of indigenous nations across the East Coast is one of the saddest stories, and this Thanksgiving fairy tale covers it all up. And if you need further evidence of the mythology surrounding the Pilgrims, just take a trip to Plymouth, Massachusetts, and go check out Plymouth Rock. You'll find a surprisingly small, unimpressive boulder, a perfect symbol for the small, unimpressive truth behind the giant historical lie. For many indigenous people, including the Wampanoag who still exist, Thanksgiving is a national day of mourning. Since 1970, the National Day of Mourning has been observed with events like a gathering and march in Plymouth, Massachusetts. There's also the Unthanksgiving Day or Indigenous Peoples Sunrise Ceremony, which takes place at Alcatraz Island in the Bay Area. These are both important events that honor the ancestors and remember the important struggles against settler colonial policies that indigenous communities are still faced with today. Okay, let's talk about the vanishing Indian myth. When American history books talk about indigenous peoples, it's always in the past tense. It's as if indigenous peoples no longer exist. This narrative presents the taking of indigenous land not as conquest, but as the inevitable progression of Western civilization. And this is classic indigenous erasure. And the reality is indigenous nations never went anywhere. Tribal people are right here today in modern society, and indigenous cultures are not only in museums. And if indigenous peoples are vanishing, they're doing a terrible job of it. There are 574 federally recognized tribes here in the United States alone, and dozens of indigenous communities in Canada, and millions of Native Americans who live south of the border. Indigenous peoples are involved in every aspect of modern life. They own businesses, send their kids to college, they become lawyers, doctors, work in law enforcement. There are Native American actors and artists. And indigenous cultures are not vanishing. They are adapting to all the changes in the world, just like any other culture. Now, the final set of falsehoods we're going to talk about today revolves around money. The idea that Native Americans get free government checks, all Indians are rich from casinos, and Native people don't pay taxes. All these statements are untrue. The reality, Native people do not get some magical government check. Services provided by the federal government are due to treaty obligations and are severely underfunded. Many indigenous communities, not all, deal with high poverty rates and a failing infrastructure. And what Native people have already belongs to them. The United States government hasn't given tribal communities anything. It's only done a good job of taking away from indigenous nations. And indigenous people absolutely do pay taxes. Native American citizens are subject to federal income taxes just like any other citizen. And contrary to popular belief, the overwhelming majority of Native Americans do not become rich from casinos. So not all tribal citizens get per capita payments from their tribe, but if they do, That's money that comes from their nation, not the United States. So why do tribal nations get to own and operate casinos? Tribal gaming is legally governed by IGRA, the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which affirms the sovereign right of tribal nations to use gaming revenue to fund their governments and essential services. It's important to note that not all tribes operate casinos, and the majority that do are not highly profitable. Just remember this: whatever tribal members have or receive from their tribal governments belongs to them. It's not some handout given by the United States government. So in this episode, we looked at 5 big historical myths that serve the purpose of settler colonialism. These colonial narratives are designed to justify land theft, indigenous erasure, and the ongoing dispossession of indigenous rights. At its core, the entire point of these myths and stereotypes is to steal the humanity from indigenous peoples, to reduce real human beings, real cultures, to artifacts and caricatures, thus justifying land theft and settler violence. But understanding and recognizing these stereotypes and historical lies is the first step in dismantling settler colonial policies. And by rejecting these fairy tales and demanding accountability, we stop indigenous erasure. And I understand the true history is definitely not pretty: conquest, land theft, genocide. But this history is necessary to learn. All right, y'all, thank you for hanging in there with me. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. And please leave a comment below. I really do appreciate the feedback. And to my Patreons, thank you for all the support. I couldn't do this without you. I do all my filming and editing all by myself. I don't have any sponsors, no affiliates. This is something that I do because I really truly love it. So in the next episode, we're going to talk more about the Wampanoag, the myth of the first Thanksgiving, and the tragedy of King Philip's War. See you in the next one.